The rain hammered against Eleanor Price's apartment windows in downtown Chicago as she sat hunched over her desk, 3 monitors casting blue light across her exhausted face. It was past midnight on a Tuesday in March 2025, and she was doing what she always did when sleep refused to come, obsessing over cases that didn't belong to her anymore. Her apartment reflected decades of this work, filing cabinets lining every wall, photographs pinned to corkboards, newspaper clippings organized by date and location. To most people, it would look like the workspace of someone unraveling. To Eleanor, it was simply home. At 58, she had spent 30 years exposing the darkest corners of American crime. Her podcast, Unresolved, had built a loyal audience of true crime enthusiasts who hung on her every word. But Eleanor had learned long ago that public admiration didn't translate to personal connection. Her ex-husband had stopped calling years ago. Her daughter sent birthday messages through text. The cases were what remained, constant, demanding, impossible to abandon. She had won 3 Peabody Awards for her investigative journalism, but those accolades now felt like monuments to a life spent chasing ghosts instead of living it. What started as routine research that night would unravel everything. Eleanor had been reviewing cold cases from the past 18 months, a quarterly habit she maintained in case new developments emerged. But something felt different this time. A missing person case from Portland, Oregon, in September. A murdered accountant discovered in her Denver apartment in November. An unsolved stabbing in Kansas City in January. 3 cases, 3 states, 3 victims with seemingly nothing in common. Different demographics, different circumstances, different motive profiles. Yet Eleanor's instincts, honed by decades of pattern recognition, screamed that something connected them. Not just connected them, but suggested a systematic approach that law enforcement agencies operating in silos would never recognize. She pulled up the case files on her screens, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. The Portland woman, Sarah Chen, had vanished without a trace. No evidence of foul play, no clear motive, just a 32-year-old marketing consultant who left her apartment one evening and never returned. The Denver victim, Michael Rothstein, had been found stabbed 17 times, but forensics suggested a crime of rage rather than calculated murder. The Kansas City victim, Rebecca Torres, had been strangled, her body left in an alley. 3 different methods, 3 different emotional signatures, yet all 3 bodies bore an identical mark on their wrists, a small, precise scar in the shape of a crescent moon. Eleanor had nearly missed it. The mark wasn't mentioned in the official reports. It appeared only in preliminary crime scene photographs that had been part of evidence databases. A detail so small that individual investigators, overwhelmed with their own caseloads, had never cross-referenced it with cases outside their jurisdictions, but Eleanor saw it. Eleanor always saw it. Her phone buzzed. A text from her editor at the investigative news outlet she freelanced for. "You alive? Haven't heard from you in weeks." Eleanor ignored it. She did that often now. Ignored the people who tried to remain in her life while she remained perpetually elsewhere, mentally living in the crime scenes of strangers. She took a sip of cold coffee, grimaced, and refocused on the screens before her. If there was a connection, if there was a pattern, she needed to understand it before she contacted anyone. In her experience, premature disclosure had a way of triggering institutional resistance. Police departments didn't appreciate journalists discovering links they had missed. Federal agencies didn't appreciate suggestions of incompetence. What Eleanor didn't know yet was that her discovery would set in motion a chain of events that would force her to confront not just the darkness lurking in the American criminal underworld, but also the profound emptiness of a life dedicated entirely to other people's tragedies. She didn't know that a young FBI analyst with his own demons was about to cross her path, or that their collaboration would ask both of them to risk the only certainty they possessed, their professional solitude, to pursue a truth that powerful forces were determined to keep buried. For now, she simply worked through the night, her apartment growing colder as the Chicago wind picked up outside, printouts spreading across her floor like the evidence of a life spent searching for answers that might not exist. The first pattern was emerging. Eleanor had no idea how deep the darkness went. Caleb Morris hadn't slept in 36 hours, and it showed. His apartment in Arlington, Virginia, was a testament to systematic chaos. Every surface covered with notebooks, filled with data correlations, his laptop displaying multiple dashboards that tracked crime statistics across federal databases. At 29, he possessed the kind of analytical brilliance that his superiors at the FBI's Criminal Analysis Division both celebrated and resented. He saw patterns others missed, but his methods were unconventional, sometimes bordering on obsessive to the point of insubordination. The photograph on his nightstand, the only personal decoration in the entire apartment, showed a man in an FBI windbreaker, arm around a young Caleb at age 15. That was his father, Agent Thomas Morris, photographed 6 months before he was killed during what official reports called a routine investigation into a white-collar crime ring in Baltimore. The reports had never fully explained what happened that night. Caleb had spent the last 14 years convinced they were lying, or at least incomplete in their conclusions. His father was meticulous, careful, brilliant. He didn't simply die in an accident. Something had been covered up. That obsession had driven Caleb into the FBI, convinced that if he rose high enough, became valuable enough, he might someday access the full details of his father's death. What he found instead was an institution as fragmented and tribal as any bureaucracy, where information was hoarded, jurisdictions were jealously guarded, and cases that didn't fit neat narratives were quietly shelved. He'd become the best data analyst in his division by necessity. It was the only way to see the bigger picture that the siloed structure of American law enforcement deliberately obscured. His supervisor, Special Agent Rita Chen, had warned him about his methods. "You're seeing connections that don't exist," she had told him last week. "You're like a man who's convinced that every shadow is part of the same monster." Caleb had wanted to respond that she simply lacked the pattern recognition skills to follow his logic, but he'd learned that such responses damaged his credibility. Instead, he'd nodded and continued his work in the spaces between official assignments. That morning, something remarkable appeared in the National Crime Database, a routine entry that would have been ignored by most analysts. A crescent-shaped scar matching previous victims in locations that shouldn't be connected. Caleb's systems had been programmed to flag any recurring physical markers across state lines. This was his obsession made institutional, a way to see what others couldn't or wouldn't. He immediately began cross-referencing. Within hours, he'd found the pattern Eleanor had discovered independently. His hands trembled as he compiled the data. 3 victims, 3 states, 3 different circumstances, but one identical mark. The methodological diversity suggested someone deliberately changing their approach to avoid detection, which meant sophisticated planning, which meant this wasn't random violence, but something calculated. Caleb knew he should file an official report through channels. He should bring it to Agent Chen and let the bureaucratic machinery grind forward, but he also knew what would happen. The case would be assigned to local field offices, information would be compartmentalized, and the pattern would be lost in jurisdictional disputes. Just like what had happened to his father's death, he made a decision that would change everything. He began researching independent investigators, true crime journalists, anyone outside the FBI structure who might have already seen what he was seeing. It took only an hour to find Eleanor Price's name. Her podcast was legendary in certain circles, meticulous, rigorous, fearless. She had exposed crimes that law enforcement had given up on. If anyone would understand what this pattern meant, it would be her. He sat at his desk, cursor hovering over the email composition field, knowing that contacting a journalist directly violated FBI protocol. His supervisor would find out. His clearance might be challenged. But the same instinct that had driven him to become an analyst, the same need to understand hidden truths that had destroyed his personal life and isolated him from his peers, compelled him forward. He typed Eleanor's email address into the field and began composing a message that would introduce him as someone who had seen the same pattern she had, from inside the federal system itself. Outside his window, Arlington was waking to another grey morning. Caleb had no idea that somewhere in Chicago, Eleanor Price was making a parallel decision to reach out, or that their meeting would force both of them to question whether the truth they were seeking was worth the cost of finding it. For now, he simply hit send, committing himself to a path that his training had prepared him for, and his conscience demanded he follow. Eleanor received the email at 9:47 a.m. on a Thursday, and her first instinct was suspicion. Anonymous FBI analysts didn't typically reach out to independent journalists about active patterns, yet the information Caleb had sent was too detailed, too aligned with her own conclusions, to be coincidence or fabrication. He'd included metadata she hadn't yet discovered, connections between the victims' financial histories, overlapping locations they'd visited, insurance policies and bank transactions that suggested these three people, despite appearing unconnected, had actually moved through similar circles. She called a contact she maintained in the bureau, someone she trusted enough to ask careful questions. Within an hour, she'd confirmed that Caleb Morris was real, that he worked in criminal analysis, and that he had exactly the kind of clearance that would give him access to the information he'd shared. More importantly, her contact mentioned that Caleb had a reputation, brilliant but difficult, someone whose methods occasionally exceeded his authority, someone carrying personal baggage that made him push harder than protocol suggested. They met in person on a Friday evening in a neutral location, a coffee shop in Maryland, roughly equidistant between Chicago and Arlington. Eleanor almost didn't recognize him when he walked in. Caleb was younger than she'd expected, with the exhausted intensity of someone running on caffeine and purpose rather than sleep. His hands shook slightly as he ordered a black coffee, and she noticed him scanning the cafe for exits and unfamiliar faces. Someone trained to assume surveillance, though probably not currently under it. "You saw the crescent mark," Eleanor said without preamble, once they'd settled into a back booth. "Same as you," Caleb confirmed. 17 days ago. I've been correlating data ever since. The mark appears in preliminary crime scene photographs that never made it into official reports. Someone deliberately excluded it from the distributed case files. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coffee shop's air conditioning. In her experience, deliberate omission of evidence usually indicated either incompetence or intentional concealment. Neither option was reassuring. "What else have you found?" Caleb pulled out a laptop, moving it toward her screen, visible only from their angle. What he showed her was devastating in its implications. The three victims hadn't simply crossed paths randomly. Their movements suggested they'd been tracked, their routines monitored, their vulnerabilities assessed. Someone had studied them with methodical precision before deciding to move forward with the murders. This wasn't the work of an angry individual or a desperate criminal. This was calculated. "The FBI doesn't see it yet," Caleb said quietly. "I submitted preliminary findings through official channels 3 days ago. Nothing. No response, no assignment to task force, no interdepartmental coordination. It's like I filed the paperwork into a void, which suggests someone at the Bureau already knows what we're beginning to understand," Eleanor said, her journalist's instincts moving into higher gear. "And they're actively suppressing it." The weight of that statement hung between them. They were no longer dealing with a simple series of crimes. They were dealing with institutional resistance, which meant there were stakes far beyond typical criminal prosecution. Someone powerful wanted these cases to remain unconnected, to be treated as isolated incidents rather than part of a larger pattern. Over the next 3 hours, Eleanor and Caleb traded information, compared notes, and began constructing a timeline that neither could have built independently. Eleanor had the journalistic infrastructure to access public records, victim histories, and media archives. Caleb had the federal database access to pull financial records, surveillance footage, and investigative reports that never reached public consumption. Together, they were more dangerous to whoever was orchestrating this concealment than either would have been alone. By the time they left the coffee shop, they had made an unspoken commitment. Eleanor would pursue the story through traditional channels, interviews, public records, building a narrative that couldn't be suppressed once it reached her audience. Caleb would continue mining the federal databases, finding the evidence that proved institutional knowledge while protecting his source, Eleanor, and himself from direct exposure. They exchanged encrypted email addresses, established communication protocols, and agreed to meet again in 2 weeks. Walking to her car, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a genuine sense of partnership, of shared purpose beyond her own isolated pursuit of truth. It terrified her almost as much as it exhilarated her. Caleb, watching her drive away, felt the weight of his decisions settling on him. He had just crossed from professional curiosity into active conspiracy against his own agency. There would be consequences. Neither of them could have imagined how quickly those consequences would arrive, or how deeply the pattern they were unraveling would penetrate into the machinery of American power itself. The first warning came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into their investigation. Eleanor's apartment building's security system sent her a notification. Someone had attempted to access her floor twice using a key card that didn't correspond to any resident or maintenance staff. When she checked the security footage, the individual's face was deliberately obscured, hood pulled up, movements suggesting someone with professional training in avoiding detection. It wasn't a burglary attempt. Nothing in her apartment was missing. It was a message. She contacted Caleb through encrypted channels. His response was immediate and grim. His supervisor had called him into a closed-door meeting that afternoon, questioning his database access patterns, asking specifically about his interest in the 3 victims. The questions were vague enough that he couldn't prove retaliation, but specific enough that both of them understood the message had been delivered. They were being watched. What they didn't know was that the pattern they'd uncovered had deeper institutional roots than either had anticipated. The 3 victims hadn't been chosen at random. They had all been witnesses or tangential participants in a federal investigation that had been officially closed 18 months ago, an investigation involving financial crimes that traced back to people with significant political connections. Someone powerful had wanted those witnesses removed and relocated within the criminal ecosystem, making them invisible to further federal scrutiny. The murders themselves weren't random acts. They were coordinated eliminations designed to look like disconnected crimes, orchestrated by someone with access to federal law enforcement databases, someone who understood how to work within the system to prevent institutional response. The crescent mark was a signature placed deliberately for someone inside the system to find, a sign that the murders were intentional, that there was a logic behind them that transcended criminal motive. Eleanor discovered this truth while researching one of the victims' financial histories. Michael Rothstein, the Denver victim, had been an accountant who'd worked briefly for a consulting firm that turned out to be a front for structured financial activities. The company had been investigated by the FBI, but the investigation had been quietly closed. Eleanor's access to public records showed that the investigation's lead agent had been removed from the case, transferred to a different division, and then quietly allowed to resign. The timing was suspicious. When she shared this discovery with Caleb, His response was immediate and personal. His father, Thomas Morris, had been investigating the same consulting firm when he died 14 years ago. The case files had been sealed, his death officially ruled accidental, and anyone asking questions about the circumstances had been discouraged through subtle institutional pressure. The realization that Eleanor had stumbled into something connected to his father's death transformed Caleb. For 14 years, he'd been searching for answers about that night. Now fragments of truth were emerging. Not clearly, but suggested in the gaps between official narratives, in the career trajectories of agents who asked wrong questions, in the systematic erasure of evidence that pointed toward institutional corruption. Eleanor understood what she was looking at now, not just a serial killer or series of coincidental crimes, but evidence of a much deeper rot in American institutions. Someone had learned to use the system itself as a weapon, to hide behind jurisdiction and compartmentalization, to place their crimes within the blind spots of bureaucratic machinery. Exposing it would require not just connecting the victims' stories, but also demonstrating how federal authority had been twisted to facilitate their deaths. The danger escalated from surveillance to direct threats. Caleb received anonymous messages through his work email suggesting that continued investigation would have consequences for his career. Eleanor's podcast platform sent notification that multiple copyright strike attempts had been filed against her previous episodes, a coordination strategy designed to damage her credibility. Someone was applying pressure from multiple angles, trying to force them to abandon the investigation through cumulative friction. But both Eleanor and Caleb had spent their careers chasing truths that powerful people wanted hidden. They understood that pressure was often confirmation that they were moving in the right direction. Eleanor began reaching out to her network of journalists, developing the story in a way that would be difficult to suppress once distributed. Caleb continued mining the federal databases, finding evidence of the institutional machinery that had been used to conceal the crimes. By the end of April, they had constructed a narrative that was damning in its implications. The three victims were connected not just by their murders, but by their potential knowledge of federal corruption. The crescent mark wasn't a signature of madness, but a calculated signature of someone operating within institutional power. And the deliberate compartmentalization of the crimes suggested coordination at a level that transcended individual criminal agency. As Eleanor sat in her Chicago apartment late one night, reviewing the final pieces of the story for publication, she realized that exposing this would change her life irrevocably. She would no longer be a respected journalist investigating external crimes. She would be someone who had exposed institutional complicity, someone who had turned her investigative powers inward on the machinery of government itself. The professional costs would be significant. The personal costs might be even greater. She thought of Caleb, isolated in his Arlington apartment, continuing his work despite knowing that his career at the FBI was effectively over. She thought of her daughter, who had stopped texting on her birthday. She thought of the decades she'd spent accumulating accolades and professional respect while building nothing else in her life. The truth had never comforted her the way other people believed it might. It had only deepened her isolation, pulled her further from human connection, made her question whether any of it had been worth the cost. Yet she continued working, because Eleanor Price had learned long ago that the only thing worse than the cost of pursuing the truth was the cost of abandoning it. Some crimes, once glimpsed, couldn't be unseen. Some patterns, once recognized, demanded response. And some journeys, once begun, could only end in destinations that destroyed the traveler in the process of reaching them.